Are Jews unusually clever? I believe so. I mean, just by way of example, did you know that the Hollywood movie industry was created largely by Jews? Most of the producers and directors were Jews. The likes of Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, David Selznick, the great musical comedy teams, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Loewe, and practically all of the great film score composers were Jewish. In fact, when you look at all the great film composers, there are really only two standout composers who were not Jewish: John Williams and John Barry, the great comedians of the 60s, Mel Brooks, Milton Berle, Chuck Benny, the list goes on. And how about this one? Of all the Americans who won a Nobel Prize, some 25%, I believe, are Jewish, though Jews make up only about 2% of the American population. Now, of course, all this is very racialist sounding, and I might add that I have observed in my lifetime that certain races excel more than others in fields of human endeavour. And I think not just about the Jews, but the Chinese. And one thing about two very disparate races, the Chinese and the Jews, is that they both seem to possess something which not every race possesses. And it's an ineffable human quality that I call drive. And I think that's probably more to the point than intelligence or raw intelligence per se. Now, this thing of drive is something of a double-edged sword. It is admirable that a person has drive, but it also can be a point of friction. And in the case of both the Jews and the Chinese, it is a national and cultural trait which serves to make them somewhat unpopular in some quarters. A practical application of this, apart from just a general condition of anti-Semitism or anti-Chinese sentiment, is that in countries of Southeast Asia, where there is a Chinese diaspora, there are quotas in place restricting entrance of Chinese to universities and such. Another observation that I came across many years ago was that there were four towering figures who had shaped the modern world, and that was Darwin, Freud, Marx and Einstein, only one of whom was not Jewish. Now, I refer to myself as a Brit for socio-religious reasons that I won't go into right at the moment, but I did wonder about whether that list could have been somewhat reformulated, given that Freud has pretty much fallen by the wayside, and Marx, of course, was always dodgy right from the get-go. If you were to put in Isaac Newton and William Shakespeare into the mix, you would have 3 Brits and 1 Jew instead of the other way around. I guess this is all very subjective. I was always a big Bob Dylan fan who recently won a Nobel Prize, and it's interesting that over the years, although I did consider him to be a musical genius, as did everybody else, I did get a very strong impression with the passage of time that what he really had was drive, a single-minded motivation to succeed. He was a really hard worker, and I think this has got a lot to do with the impression that the Jews are smarter than everybody else. And of course, that's a talent in its own right, but something not recognised as much as maybe it should be, in preference to the more abstract notion of pure intelligence. I do wonder about a question that many people may have thought about, and I certainly do. If Jews are so smart, why aren't they running the world? I'm sure many Jewish people have thought that. Now, of course, for religious reasons, as is set out in the Old Testament, the Israelite people were prophesied to suffer for their disobedience to God's will and have been in exile and oppression for centuries. There are an Israelite people who have ruled the world, what I call the Brits. It comes from the Hebrew word berith, meaning the covenant people, the British. But the Jews have also ruled the world in their condition of exile and depression in those particular ways that I just mentioned. And it all speaks to the goal of human history, the purposes that God has for the world and his chosen people. As listeners may know, I place 10 of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel in Western Europe in accordance with the Jewish historian Josephus writing back in the days of the Roman Empire, where he placed the 2 tribes of the southern kingdom of Judah, called in those days Judea, and the remaining 10 tribes of the dispersion around the Black Sea area, and who subsequently migrated into Western Europe, where they bore the name of the Israelite people in exile, the Gauls, or the Galatei, in Hebrew, Gaulah and Galut. But in that greater Israelite entity, the Jews were themselves an especially favoured people in the eyes of God, as it says in the book of Isaiah, chapter 5, verse 7, that Israel is the vineyard of the Lord, and the men of Judah are his special planting. And the prophet Jeremiah, in chapter 50, verse 6, describes the Israelites preyed upon anciently by the Assyrian and Babylonian empires as being a sheep that has been devoured by the Assyrians, leaving the bones, which are the house of Judah and the people of Judah, the Jews, devoured by the Babylonians. So the Jews have a special status in God's plan for the whole house of Israel and the Hebrew people. Now, with this special status in the eyes of God comes a downside. The Jewish people, much to their dismay and discomfiture, have been singled out for special punishment due to their failure to abide by the covenant they'd made with their God, and suffer not because they are especially bad or evil, but because they fall short of their special obligations under the covenant with their God. These especially chosen people are especially put upon and have lived lives of suffering for centuries. Of course, many people, including the Jews, find this state of affairs somewhat inexplicable. You would think the God, the all-powerful God who watches over them, might keep them from such straitened circumstances. And it is truly ironic when you look at Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who likewise ended his days on a Roman cross. People would be forgiven for thinking that there's a certain theme operating here, and what is required is an understanding of the principle of redemption and the special purposes for which God has chosen people to be his servants. Jesus Christ was blameless, but nevertheless he suffered something like the fate of the chosen people. Counterpointed against their sufferings, the Jews will indeed have their day in the sun, and in the meantime they are called upon to hope and endure all things until that day comes in faith and belief. And if the Jews aren't presently ruling the world, as always, they are at the centre of world events in more recent history with the re-establishment of the State of Israel. And this reminds us all of the fact that here is a people whose destiny is being worked out before our eyes at this time.